Hi there. Welcome to the Sober Circle channel. Enjoy this speaker tape.
This recording is part of the Northern California Tape Library about alcoholism and was recorded at the 9th Annual Reno Spring Festival of Alcoholics Anonymous, held in Sparks, Nevada, on May the 9th through the 11th, 1980. This is the closing meeting of May the 11th. The speaker, Wes Johnson of Los Angeles, California. Please observe the traditions of Alcoholics Anonymous and do not play this recording for entertainment or commercial purposes. And please do not break the anonymity of the speaker or any AA member at any public level. The original record and this copy were both made by Bart Daniel of 1332 Santa Ynez Way, Sacramento, California, zip 95816.
It's my pleasure now to introduce our speaker this morning. It's a privilege anytime to share in an AA meeting or an AA conference. This morning it's a special privilege for me to introduce Wes as our speaker because I was privileged to hear a tape that he had, of a talk he'd made at another meeting, and I was really impressed with it. I think you'll love what he has to say. Okay, now we hear Les from California.
Wes? You taking over the election here? Where am I? Oh. Thank you. Hi, everybody. My name is Wes J. I'm an alcoholic. I'm glad to be here. I'm always glad to be at an Alcoholics Anonymous meeting. I want to begin by thanking the committee for inviting me, especially Howard C. And I have to kind of go with Chuck's observation of Friday night, the one he made about being demoted. I've had the privilege of many such participations as this, but it's the first time I've ever been given the assignment of following Chuck in Alabama, you know. Two people that I revere in this program because of the example that they have always given, they've always presented to us. Happy Mother's Day to the mothers who are here present today. And at least for the duration of this meeting, I hope you mothers will not consider the role that you often wind up with when we do our 4 steps. That's kind of subtle, but anyway. As many of you may have gathered, I have no eyesight. And this renders especially special for me the experience of listening to the reading of our selections. I thought the reading of the promises this morning was especially nice, appropriate. As you know, here in the West, we read chapter 5 and chapter 3 and the traditions and certain other selections. And when this happens, I sit there in a kind of a private world, engaged in a visit with the speaker, or the reader, I should say. Because I can tell from where his inflections fall, I think, something about him and his program. And it's a shared experience, whether he's aware of it or not. And off of this practice over the years has spun, call it a hobby. In that, and I'm sure you've experienced this at one time or another, in that our readers, in their seriousness, in their earnestness, in their determination, will sometimes blow a sentence or a phrase, and the result is instructive. So while I'm settling down up here, I thought I might share one or two of these with you. For example, I remember the instance when a fellow launched into chapter 5 with, "Rarely have we seen a person go to jail who has thoroughly followed our path." Or further down on the first page of chapter 5, you know, if you've decided you want what we have and are willing to go to any lengths to get it, then you are ready to take certain steps. At some of these we barked, you know. Or step 6. We were entirely ready to have God restore all these defects of character. This one is kind of suspicious. Watch it in step 10. We continued to take personal inventory, and when we were wrong, promptly omitted it, you see. Down south, I'm called on often, and I enjoy the experience and the privilege of pitching at Narcotics Anonymous meetings, Overeaters Anonymous meetings, and so on. I don't use this one at Narcotics Anonymous meetings. Step 11. We sought through prayer and medication. The first sentence right after step 12. Many of us exclaimed, "What an odor," you know. One of my babies, she happens to be a member of OA, was for the time she was in USC, one of the cheerleaders down there. And she has this terrible thing with food, but she's getting together a marvelous program. And in reading chapter 5, there on page 59, she improved one of the sentences, I think. The sentence itself is almost pontifical, as it states, "Half measures availed us nothing." But this darling girl, racing along in her sincerity, came out with, "Half-ass measures availed us nothing." I hear you. Perhaps the one that gets it all together best kind of sums this whole business up, and then I'll get on with the business of my story. This young lady, again, it was a young lady, was reading chapter 5, and she got down to the steps, and it all happened something about like this. Here are the steps we took, which I suggested as a program of recovery. 1, we admitted that we were powerless over alcohol, that our lives had become unmentionable. In a brief exchange with Irene just before I stood up, I suggested I might sort of cut back on the drunkalogue this morning and talk about the program of recovery a little more. But nevertheless, let me begin by sharing with you the fact that I came to our program for the first time in July of 1960. And because of what I have learned with you here, I can now say briefly and efficiently that at that time, I was physically ill, I was mentally ill, I was emotionally ill, and although I thought I knew the meaning of the word spiritual, it turns out that I didn't know anything at all. It was a Monday morning, and I couldn't get out of bed to make it to a bathroom door that was less than 10 feet away. Lying there full of sickness, misery, anger, confusion, uncertainty, and wondering rather idly what to do about it all, and really not caring very much. When the phone rang, it was my desk buddy at work who had called up for the purpose of finding out what to tell the boss in case the boss came around looking for me. We had performed this mutual support service for each other over the years. And in the process, we got to talking about what a mess I was in. What else was there to talk about? And this non-alcoholic, I had a talk with him a couple of months ago. He's getting near retirement, and he thinks he's having a little trouble with the amount of coffee he's drinking, you know. But in this conversation back there in July of 1960, after we talked about me for a few minutes, he gave me the first suggestion I ever had about our program. He said, "Well, have you ever thought of calling Alcoholics Anonymous?" And I was annoyed. Yet, in July of 1960, I could stand and look back on a drinking career that at that time had lasted for the better part of 25 years. And the longest I've searched that period with my 4th and 5th and 10th steps in the program and your help and whatever, the more I have been unable to find anything that comfortably satisfies my definition of a normal drink. In fact, I'm without the ability to define the term normal or social drinking at this moment. I don't know what that means. And yet when my friend suggested, "Well, have you ever thought of calling Alcoholics Anonymous?" I was irritated. You know, why do I need them? Who are they? What's that all about? And his answer to this is still very useful. He said, "Well, it beats nothing." And thinking, you know, which may very well be the understatement of the century, you know. And looking back on that years later, I came to the conclusion, I've never asked him about it, but it seems to me that he may have been aware of something that it took me years to learn here in the program. That where it really counted, in the business or art of living, if you will, I really had nothing going for me. Oh, I had a beautiful Jaguar sitting down on the driveway, and I was the staff engineer at Hughes Aircraft, and I had a fine closet of clothes, and I was running back and forth and so forth and so on, but there I was lying in that mess with nowhere to go. So later on that morning, with a kind of an oh, why not attitude, I'll see what this is all about, I picked up the phone and I called in. And from the beginning, I discovered that you knew what you were about. This is no fly-by-night affair. You were and you still are in dead seriousness about this illness we call alcoholism. A grand old-timer who many of you will remember, who retired, I guess it was, last year in January, Carol A. was on the phones that day, and Carol answered the phone. Do you have anything in the house? And I said, no. He says, okay, I'm going to have someone call you in about 30 minutes. This was the essence of the first conversation. And in about 30 minutes, the first 12-stepper ever to call on me, a fellow named Dwayne, and I shall never forget him. He called, and he was at work. And we talked for a few minutes, and again I sensed that he knew what he was all about. And after a few minutes' conversation, he said, well, now, Wes, here's my situation. I'm at work, and I'm into something that I'd like to finish for my boss today. I later learned that he is an accountant. I'd like to finish this and get it to my boss today, but if you need me, I'll come now. And I almost cried over that, because it had been a very long time since anyone had expressed that kind of concern about me, and here it came from a total stranger. So I said, well, what do you suggest? And he said, well, I can be there about 5:30. And I said, fine. I figured I could make it that long. And again, according to his promise, at about 5:30, he knocked on the door, and he came in, and I really didn't know what to expect. I had heard about Carrie Nation and chopping up bars and all that sort of stuff, but what happens with this AA thing, I wouldn't have been surprised if he'd walked in, pointed his finger at me, and told me to fall on my knees and confess my sins or something, No, he didn't. And he gave me a model for my 12-step work. He simply walked in, and by this time I was on my feet rattling around that apartment in a stinking terry cloth bathrobe, shaking, trembling. Your hands are trembling so badly that you're embarrassed, even when you're alone in your own apartment. You want to sit on them, or you don't know whether to sit down or get up and run, and so forth. As I stand here this morning at just a shade under 6'4", I'm weighing about 210. That day, at about the same height, I was weighing less than 145 pounds, so you have an idea what I look like. This didn't bother him. It didn't faze him at all. He came in the door, and he simply put out his hand, and in a warm, quiet confidence, he said, my name is Dwayne, and I'm an alcoholic. First one I'd ever met. And he went on to say, and I'm a member of Alcoholics Anonymous. And instead of reading me the riot act about me, which is what I kind of half expected, he sat down and he started to tell me about himself and about this program and about our fellowship. And somewhere along in here, he got down to a really profound question. He says, well, now, when did you eat last, What kind of a question is that? I don't know how long I'd been drinking at that time, so he went into the kitchen and racked up some soup, I think it was, and I started to get that down and began to feel a little better, and somewhere in our exchange, he said, well, now I'd like to take you to a meeting, one of our meetings tonight. And I said, sure. And here, let me say quickly that I've never had any trouble coming back to meetings. I said, but I ought to have a bath. And he says, of course. And he quickly stripped down to his waist. I was in such bad shape, he was afraid I'd slip and fall in the shower. But he watched me, and I got through the shower all right. And if you ever run into Dwayne, he's still very active in the Riverside area. Tell him I'm still telling this story about him. I stepped out of the shower, got through that without any mishap. He was an experienced 12-stepper. He was cool, and when it came to shaving, I blew his cool. And you understand what I'm reporting to you when I explain that I'm one of those who, for as long as he could, shaved with an old-fashioned straight-edge razor. And I stepped out of the shower and I started to strap this razor, you know. And I heard his cool evaporate. He says, "You're not going to shave with that, are you?" And I said, "If you remember how humble you were at this moment in your adventures, you know that I promptly explained to him that I had shaved with this damn thing all my life, and I'd often shaved with it on the bouncing end of a railroad car, you know, like in Pullmans and stuff." And he said, "But just the same, don't you have a safety razor somewhere?" So I'm sure he had visions of parts of nose or ear or chin or something lying around in some kind of a mess. I got a pretty good shave out of it. That night we went to our first meeting. It was over on Lancashire. I shall never forget the feeling that I experienced when I went into the room, when I entered the room. The people who said what they said, and it's happening here this morning, they meant what they said when they said such things as, "Glad to have you. Come in. Have a seat." Dwayne dashed off and got me a cup of coffee, and a couple of others turned their chairs around, and we were rapping and talking and so forth. And I saw they had that something which all of our speakers have been talking about here. Clear-eyed, bushy-tailed, and so forth. A feeling that I'd never experienced before. We were particularly fortunate that night in that our speaker was a charming lady, an elderly lady, very much, I should say, very much like our charming lady speaker of last night. She told us about her drinking career in north central Ohio in the late 20s and the early 30s. As a matter of fact, I was halfway home before I remembered those were Prohibition years, you know. But she had neatly solved this problem because she simply put her jug in her knitting basket, you know. She'd ride around the streetcars or sit on the park bench and whatnot, and you'd have to get pretty close to Granny to see she was half squashed, you know. I thought that was out of sight, you know. So the next time you see a little old lady sitting in the park knitting, you know, watch her closely. It was marvelous. There she was, crisp, fresh, had on a little corsage, and just sparkling. And I said, "This is an alcoholic, you know, you make these discoveries." Later on in that pitch, she said something which I believe I have a duty always to repeat when I pitch. And it is addressed to those who are new here, or who may be relatively new. Because toward the end of her pitch, this lovely lady turned in our direction. There were 4 or 5 of us newcomers sort of in the same area. And she said this, and I have never forgotten it, and since she's passed on, according to my information, I'll pass it on to you in her name. "Newcomers," she said, "give us your best shot at this thing. Come and sit in with us here and have a long and a thoroughly responsible examination of what it is we're doing. This way of life that we talk about. This happiness, this self-discovery, this awareness, this fellowship. How long? That's up to you. It is anyway, really. It may be 6 months, it may be a year, it may be 90 meetings in 90 days, so long as it is a thoroughly responsible examination of what we're doing. If at the end of whatever period of time you have decided upon, you decide that what we have is not for you, of course you're free to go. We have nothing to refund you but your misery. We have nothing to return to you but the fear that brought you to us in the first place." And as I heard both Chuck and Alabama say, "Don't be afraid of this thing." At the end of that first meeting, I was standing up in the middle of the floor, more correctly, trembling in the middle of the floor, and I was in such bad shape that I had to back all the way across the room to find something to lean against. You know, kind of like a trembling reed, if you want to be formal about it. I'm leaning against the wall, and the regulars are coming by and shaking my hand, and I begin to hear the slogans for the first time. The slogans which here have so much guts in them, I like to say. Now, make lots of meetings. Keep coming back. Read the big book. Get with the winners. Easy does it. One day at a time. Let go. And let God. And finally, I shall never forget this I don't call anybody in this program elderly. It just doesn't happen here. They just get more bright-eyed and bushy-tailed. Is the best way to say that. So I remember this couple. They were probably in their middle 70s, and he was in Bavarian shorts, walking shorts or something like that. Remember, it was in July. And he's got a hold of my elbow and my hand, and he's pumping my hand and talking program. And I took the lady at his right shoulder to be his wife. Now, he pumped and pumped, and he talked and talked. And I'm sorry to say I don't remember anything that he said. But I do remember the impression that I'll call her his wife, seems to have been one of those ladies who knew that she had to wait until her husband ran out of breath before she could get a word in edgewise. And when he ran out of breath or ran down, the pump had slowed down now. She looked up at me out from underneath just a lovely shock of gray hair and bright, clear eyes, and she was in some kind of a moo-moo. And this is what I like to call her edgewise word. She says, "And yes, young man, you will discover that you'll get your sex life back again." Now, I'm in no position to guarantee anything about this program, but I will refer you to Dr. Silkworth's letter, where he tells his colleagues of his profession that they may rely absolutely on what we tell them of ourselves. But I've only been tested. I've loved telling this story for years now. I've only been tested once, and it deserves to be included here. I was out at I guess that was San Marino, San Gabriel, for a luncheon meeting one day, and we had one newcomer, that is, one who stood up. And right after the meeting, probably at the suggestion of his 12-stepper, he came up to thank me for my pitch. And after saying something kindly or complimentary, while we were shaking hands, I knew he was new because I could still feel that hard rock, how it goes. And so he opened up the subject this way. He says, "Wes, now you brought it up. May I ask you, did you get your sex life back again?" So for one moment, I hedged or hesitated, and I looked in his direction. I said, "Well, sir, how old are you?" He said, "Well, I'm 64, so I figured I was home free, I said, "Well, by all means, get lots of rest." I recommend vitamins, Stay off the booze, the right food. And then I began to discover that some of our slogans even fit this question. Easy does it, First things first, And so on. Yes. In 1964, out at the Hollywood Saturday Night Group, I took the short pitch. And after that pitch, one of our grand old-timers, who most of you here will probably know, I guess it's Sybil C. now. If my numbering is correct, I believe Sybil will take something like her 40th birthday cake this year. She and her brother were prime movers in AA around 1940 when we're getting started down there. And after the meeting, she and her husband and a few others were having coffee. And she said this to me. She said, "Wes, there's something you can do for our fellowship that would be very helpful." She said, "Whenever you pitch, tell us how you stay sober." She says, "I don't need to point out that at any Alcoholics Anonymous meeting you will find the world's greatest collection of experts on how to get drunk." She said, "But we're here to stay sober." And she pointed as a basis for her suggestion, it was really unnecessary, but it was a useful thing to do. As a basis for her suggestion, she pointed to the last sentence of the preamble with which Irene opened our meeting today. And that sentence reads, "Our primary purpose is to stay sober and to help other alcoholics to achieve sobriety." And a large part of what I came to discover about this program is located in this sentence. For example, if we look at the first half of the sentence, it says something that we may miss until someone calls it to our attention. Our primary purpose here is to stay sober. It is my point that it does not say get sober. there's a significant difference between getting sober and staying sober. And if anyone asks me any responsible question about the alcoholic personality, the thing that I would say to them, such as doctors and therapists and whatnot, the problem is more accurately described that we are people who cannot stay sober. As Chuck pointed out in his pitch, we're people who often can get sober. Oh, hell, we see what we're doing. We shape up, oh, blah, 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 and on. But we can't stay sober. And it took me about 6 or 7 years to discover that, and I was hearing it at every meeting. But our primary purpose here is in 2 parts. Stay sober and help other alcoholics to achieve sobriety. And I guess it was in 1967, about, 3 some odd years, whatever it was, 3.5 years, I'll say, after my last drink, it suddenly struck me that we had a primary purpose that was in 2 parts. And as I sometimes do, I pick up the phone when I'm hit with a revelation of this magnitude, and I call up a gentleman who is here present this morning. I'll leave him nameless, but he has referred to himself as the Sage of Laguna, you know. And incidentally, perhaps here's the place to stop and mention, to get you to share with me in some expression of gratitude for the tremendous contribution that Chuck Chamberlain has made to our fellowship by his work and by his example over these 34 years. And we mustn't forget Alabama. She's another one of those great champions whose examples go before us to show us the way. Anyway, this is before he retired, and I called him up and I said, "Say, I think I found something, you know." I said, according to this sentence in our preamble, it tells me that our primary purpose here is in 2 parts. He was at his office, I guess. 1, stay sober. The other, help alcoholics or help other alcoholics to achieve sobriety. And as he sometimes does, if you come at him with an idea, you know, he's kind of like a bullfighter. He will step aside, you know, he doesn't say it, but you sort of feel like he's saying, you know, ole. So hear this, he said, "Well, how do you feel about that?" Meaning, in effect, what does that mean to you? And my answer to him then was this thought in just about these words, and it is still my answer today. I said, "Chuck, it seems to me that what this means is that I am in the province of a higher power whose basic instruction seems to be, do your best at both, or you may discover that you can't have either one." Obviously, if I'm not staying sober, I cannot do anything of real importance, I suspect, to help somebody else to get sober. And if I'm not doing my best to share this program to the best of my ability, my suspicion is I probably will not be allowed to keep it. Therefore, this last sentence with this commentary stands out in 3 dimensions from the page for me. Our primary purpose here is to stay sober and to help other alcoholics to achieve sobriety. Now, in talking about how I stay sober, let me make a recommendation which I hope you'll take up. Get as close to the biggest and best dictionary that you can. Because so often we think we know the meaning, the definition of terms that we're using every day, and it turns out that we create a lot of confusion in just ordinary interaction with each other because we're using a word and we don't really understand what it means. Let me give you an example. I learned this sort of indirectly from a grand old timer named Kai V. Kai has passed on. He was a serious, sort of a studious and a formal type of gentleman. And we got into a little nitpicking discussion, it wasn't really an argument, over the meaning of the term sobriety. And so he didn't have much time, his ride was leaving. He said, "Well, why don't you look it up in a dictionary?" I said, "Okay, I'll do just that." I was going to show him that I knew more about the meaning of the word sobriety than I thought he knew, you see. Well, when I went through a Funk and Wagnall library-sized dictionary, the usual definitions for the term sobriety will be found there, but I had completely forgotten this one. Sobriety, moderation in thought and deed, Sobriety, moderation in thought and deed. Chapter 6 of the book Alcoholics Anonymous, and I quote, "We believe that person who feels that mere sobriety is enough is unthinking." Chapter 5, "Our liquor was but a symptom." And we stay here to discover that our alcoholic behavior is but the surface symptom of deeper living problems. And until we take this magnificent kit of tools which our program gives us and go to work on those living problems, our people don't bite their tongue when they tell us that we may very well discover that we can't help going back to booze. Sobriety, moderation in thought and deed. I came in the fellowship with Dwayne's help, and I picked a home group over there on Santa Barbara, just 2 or 3 blocks from where I live, the old Bob White group, which is no longer in existence. And for the first 9 months, things went well. I was no longer drinking, which meant I'd made a tremendous amend to the police departments thereabouts. You know, I was no longer getting into jail, and I was no longer driving my vehicle around under the influence of alcohol. It meant that I was getting to work on time, which is to say I was giving my employer the 40 hours a week that he was paying me for. I was into physical recovery. I was feeling better all the time. I was participating rather actively in that group. We would take meetings downtown to the Midnight Mission 1 night a month, things like that. Coming along, you might say, when one night a speaker, pitching in our neighborhood group, as I am this morning, made a statement. I now know he was quoting directly from Chapter 3 of our book, when he said, "If you have any doubts as to whether or not you're an alcoholic, try some controlled drinking." Now, you would have thought I would have remembered something of the big book, which I read in just about its entirety the night of my first meeting, or that I had learned something from 9 months of activity with you and the fellowship and so forth and so on, or that I'd learned something from the explorations into why I ticked, which had gone on. But no, he made that statement. If you have any doubts as to whether or not you're an alcoholic, try some controlled drinking. I was sitting on the front row. I put my right hand on my right knee. I looked up at him, and I said to myself, you know, that's a damn good idea. You know. And on my way home that night, I got a pint, half pint actually, which is my purchase. And whenever I blew it this way, for some reason I haven't yet worked out, it seems to have taken me 3 months to get back. Which is to say it took me about 3 months to get enough and to get up the courage to swallow my pride, you know, that negative pride, and go back. And I'm still actively in contact with many of the folks of that original old Bob White group, and when I went back, they put out their hands and they shook mine, and, "Hi, it's good to see you. Glad you're here." And to this day, none of them have ever asked me where I'd been, you know. They had caused me to understand that this is an illness, and if I went out on a blast, don't stay out there and die. Come back. And I did. But for these first 3 years and 2 months, I seem to have had some problem. Oh, I'm terribly bright. I must have an IQ that's through the roof. But I had some difficulty connecting the fact that I was attending these meetings because it had something to do with my drinking problem, you know. So at every convenient opportunity, I seemed to find a way to forget it, you know. During this period, to give you a couple of representative examples, I was at dinner with a young lady who was not my second wife, and I must add, without the knowledge, consent, or approval of my second wife. And she made a truly brilliant suggestion. She says, "You know, Wes, no steak is worth a damn without a glass of wine." I said, "You're right, dear. Waitress, you know, 3 months, you know, as silly as that." The last of these capers took place in the latter part of August, perhaps the first part of September of 1963. I got so bent out of shape at that second wife of mine that although I was 43 years old at the time, I ran away from home. Now, this has value now. You know, we alcoholics never do things by halves. Please understand that. Any visitors, you know, it's either all the way off or flat out. But had I done it properly, I probably would have gone down to the airport and gotten on a plane and come to, you know, up to Frisco, DiMaggio's, the top of the mark. I mean, little style. Or the great trains were still running from Southern California. I might have gotten on, the Golden State and went into the lounge car and rode down to the first stop, wherever that is, I don't know. But not me. Beautiful car in the garage, I can still drive it. I blew my stack at that woman, marched out the front door, walked a block to the corner liquor store, went into a phone booth, called a cab, went downtown to the Greyhound bus station, and bought a round-trip ticket to Huntington Beach, 35 miles away. And I stayed down there until I figured certain people were properly punished, you know. And when I figured they'd had about as much as I wanted to put on them, I let myself be discovered. And with a great deal of very satisfying hullabaloo and noise and all that jazz, my wife and my sister's husband came down and collected me, basket case that I was, you know, and brought me back to Los Angeles. That was during the week of September 15th, 1963. That Friday, I went back to my regular neighborhood home group meeting. And I am pleased, of course, to be able to share with you the fact that since that caper, I have not found it necessary to touch anything containing alcohol. But I must be quick to emphasize that I don't know why this is so, except for one simple reason. I did not find it necessary to take a drink today. As has been pointed out here, this is a daily program, and if I let my program start ripping off, intentionally or unintentionally, larger chunks of time, it promotes problems. Now, to answer Sybil's question, how do I stay sober? In the beginning, you gave me essentially two questions. The first of these is, are you having trouble with your drinking? You didn't ask me, now, are you an alcoholic, or do you think you're an alcoholic, or blah, blah, blah. The term alcoholic implies knowledge, experience, insight, diagnosis, that kind of thing. You didn't take me that far. You simply gave it to me as simple as possible, and I could understand that. Are you having trouble with your drinking? And I said, my answer was, yes. And then the next question you gave me was equally as simple and equally as important. Do you want to do something about it? It's a way of dealing with the surrender question, which both Chuck and Alabama came in touch with. And in my opinion, it's a way of reaching out for whatever shreds of self-esteem may remain in the newcomer. Because I got here with mine pretty badly clobbered. And you reached for that with that question. You were on the way to teaching me that I had a choice. And it was included in the form of this question. Do you want to do something about it? And my answer to that was and is yes. And okay, you said to me, and you are still saying to me, okay, if you want the things we've got, do the things we've done. The program can be described as simply as that. If you want the things we've got, do the things we've done for one thing and one thing only, and that is sobriety. It's quite easy to understand how in the things we do between each other and our dynamics, you might call it, we get involved in this kind of question, that kind of answer, this kind of difficulty, this kind of problem, and perhaps at times we tend to drift away from remembering that we are here to obtain and to maintain our sobriety. And I think it's important for me to remind me that that's the first reason I'm here. A lot of other things too, but this is the reason. And you taught me, remember, sobriety comes first. This is why you're here. Do that, and in time the rest will fall into place. I had been around here, I suppose, somewhere around 3 years. And going back to the reading thing that I mentioned at the beginning of my pitch, I don't have any hearing problem. I have a little headlight difficulty, but I don't have any hearing problem. Sitting at a meeting, I heard Step 12 read for the first time. Oh, I'd listened to it many times, but I heard it for the first time. Step 12. Having had a spiritual awakening as a result of these steps, we tried to carry this message to alcoholics and to practice these principles in all of our affairs. And principles, I kind of had the feeling that I'm supposed to be taking something called the steps, and they're kind of schnockering me into practicing something called the principles. And that will get my dander up in a minute, that kind of approach. But I heard that last phrase, principally, for the first time. And I thought about it, and then when I had listened to and thought about the paragraph which immediately follows Step 12, I realized that it was saying pretty much the same thing. Let me repeat that paragraph. Many of us exclaimed, "What an order, I can't go through with it." Do not be discouraged. No one among us has been able to maintain anything like perfect adherence to these principles. We are not saints. The point is that we're willing to grow along spiritual lines. The principles we have set down are guides to progress. We claim spiritual progress rather than spiritual perfection. And I set out to find out what these principles were all about. I became convinced that there was a relationship between principles and steps which would be helpful if I knew it. I got help from lots of places. One of the first places was over on the first page of Chapter 3. More about alcoholism, which gives me the portrait of the alcoholic which I could never afford to forget. My well-being, maybe even my life, depends on it. And about halfway down on the first page of that chapter, page 30, you will find this blockbuster. Quote, "We learned that we had to fully concede to our innermost selves that we were alcoholics. This is the first step in recovery." Obviously. But perhaps I was lucky because I did not associate that as being connected to their method for supporting Step 1, which is what they're doing. This is the first step in recovery, obviously. The delusion, says the next sentence, that we're like other people or presently may be, has to be smashed. Take that word delusion to your dictionary. Let me show you by this example what a dictionary is likely to do for you. Among the several definitions for delusion, you will find these two, one short and one long. The short one, fixed, false beliefs. Now, mind you, I'm looking at this word as it occurs in this sentence. Fixed, false beliefs. But I like the second one a little more because I'm kind of wordy. Delusion. Any determination to hold on to an attitude, opinion, or belief in the face of overwhelming evidence to the contrary. Look what it does to that sentence. The delusion that we're like other people or presently maybe has to be smashed. Obviously. Read our book that way and keep that dictionary at hand. And I sort of got the tone for my whole search from the first two sentences of actually both forewords, but I somehow prefer the 1939 foreword. That is the foreword to the 1939 edition. Listen to these originals as they tell us in this foreword, in the first two sentences, what it's all about. We of Alcoholics Anonymous are more than 100 men and women who have recovered from a seemingly hopeless state of mind and body. I didn't say alcoholism, doesn't say anything else. From a seemingly hopeless state of mind and body. To show other alcoholics precisely how we have recovered is the main purpose of this book. In 1974, the members of Overeaters Anonymous came to me with a kind of an admission and a request. They said, "Wes, we've discovered that the steps are the program, you know." I said, "Great. That's progress." "And would you conduct a step study group for us?" And I said, "Yes." I almost snatched their tongue out of their mouth. I said, "Yes," so fast. So after they left, as I sometimes do, he won't let me call him sponsor, but I called a certain teacher, the Oracle of Laguna, you know. I said to him, I said, "Look here, these people came and they asked me to do this thing for them, and I damn near yanked their tongue out of their mouth." I answered so fast, and so I thought I'd better talk it over with somebody. Let me tell you this about Chuck C. If you ever talk to him, watch those pauses just before he answers. He paused. Well, he says, you're all right. I think you should go ahead with it. He said, but do me a favor. I said, of course. I would instantly do anything this man asked me to do. He says, in about 6 or 8 months, call me back and tell me who was your best student. And it took me about 10 minutes after that phone call to see what that crafty rascal was up to. And it turned out, of course, that in the nearly 3 years that I conducted that step study class, certainly I was very probably my very own best student. It was a tremendous experience. To get back to these principles, I found most of the answer for the first principle, and I'm talking about the spiritual principles, the living principles, the positive principles. I found most of the answer for the first principle there in the first part of chapter 5, which I believe we read at just about all of our meetings. Again, it had been lying there waiting for me to discover it, I suppose I have to say. And again, I remind you, I don't have any hearing problem. My discovery begins with the second sentence of chapter 5. Those who do not recover are people who cannot or will not completely give themselves to this simple program, usually men and women who are constitutionally incapable of being honest with themselves. And when I hear that way, the suggestion that this is a suggested program kind of disappears for me. I'm an ex-Army top sergeant, and I understand that kind of thought. And the next 5 sentences are on the subject of honesty for us. Winding up with this one, which reaches out to include those unfortunates who are in institutions, penal institutions, medical institutions, mental institutions. We know them well. There are those, too, who suffer from grave emotional and mental disorders, but many of them do recover if they have the capacity to be honest. I had literally stumbled over and fell face forward into the first principle in this program. It was step 1 that rounded off the discovery. Now, for those who are not yet familiar with it, our book is unique in many ways. One of these is the guys who wrote it never tell us what we must do. Rather, they tell us what they did. That is to say, they give us the benefit of their example. The book is written, for the most part, I believe, in the first person plural. Here are the steps we took. This was our course. Rarely have we seen, and so forth and so on. But another way in which we like to make this point is we like to say that there are no musts in Alcoholics Anonymous. It's a kind of a way of making a point. There are lots of musts that I must apply to me. But we understand that you don't go around getting alcoholics or drunks or whatever you want to call them to do anything by telling them what they got to do. Because they'll make you number 1 in a hurry. So it's a suggested program, but perhaps the young lady leading a meeting out at Ohio Street near the Veterans Hospital there one night put it the best I've ever heard it. She says, now, for the benefit of you newcomers, I must explain. We have no must in our program here at Alcoholics Anonymous, but there's some things you better do. When I was ready to follow our guys, which is the way I call and describe the magnificent originals who wrote our program and who keep it going, when I was ready to follow them, look where they led me with step 1. Of course, they're talking about themselves with step 1, aren't they? We admitted that we were powerless over alcohol, that our lives had become unmanageable. Something which my family knew, neighbors knew, a couple of doctors that had patched me up probably knew, colleagues at work knew. I was amazed at how much they knew, really. In short, that I couldn't handle booze and my life was a mess. And when I was ready to go, it is my point here to show you how by their example they led me for the first time in my life into the first beginning application of the positive, the living, the spiritual principle in which we develop as we carry out step 1. And that principle is rigorous self-honesty, no exceptions. as it helps us to overcome dishonesty. One of the symptoms of my illness, I'll leave you to decide for yourself about yours. When I first came to this program, I didn't know anything about that kind of honesty, genuine honesty with God, with you, with me, with things, with ideas, with investment and involvement. The honesty that I brought with me might be described as a cookie jar type of honesty. And it goes something like this. You never lie. Of course not. And you must never steal. Oh, never, never. That is, unless the rewards are great enough and you figure you can get away with it. You see? I remember consciously thinking that I was pretty good at getting by without being caught at being dishonest. And that doesn't work. It's a gimmick. From the middle of July when I first came, I'm a little uncertain of the date, until September 15, 1960, about 3 years and 2 months. I have to share with you, I flipped and flopped around and didn't get started off in the right direction, however you would say that. And you might want to ask me, well, Wes, if you came to the program to do something about your drinking, why did it take you so long? And the answer to that question is simply this. I was not ready to be honest with me. Not just about drinking, but about everything in my life. And until I was ready to be honest with me, sobriety could not happen. Oh, I might go through periods of dryness, not drinking, absent, blah, 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 blah. But sobriety, the sobriety which our program leads us into, is impossible. But when I was ready to be honest and did so to the best of my ability, along the way of this process, I discovered one day that I was no longer interested in drinking. I just didn't need it anymore. And I like to suggest that what probably that indicates is that I had begun to develop something of this and the other spiritual principles. And that I had something genuine going for me in my life for the first time. Something that I have been trying to substitute for with booze. So in step one, the principle is, let's just say, honesty as it helps us to overcome dishonesty. In step two, the principle is hope as it helps us to overcome despair. And bear in mind, I'm recommending the definition that you find in the best dictionary that you can get a hold of as your starting place. And let me tell you kind of a secret about a dictionary which gives you a whole lot of definitions about a term key to the program. Go down that list of definitions, and one will zap you. And you know what? That's where you are. That's good. In step two, the principle is hope as it helps us to overcome despair. In addition to the dictionary's definition for despair, let me tell you about my own personal definition. And we'll go back to that bed in July of 1960. For more than 8 years, I had been looking for the medical help that would have helped me with to prevent the loss of my eyesight. I'd been retired for the problem in 1952 from the Air Forces. I hadn't found it. For more than 8 years, I'd been on the tail end of a first marital mess, which to this day, here in 1980, has never produced a single moment's satisfaction. I couldn't see where a guy without eyesight had any place to go. I've always been a kind of a self-starter, a fast mover. I suppose the safest way to deal with a messy situation is to get out in front of everybody else and run away from it. But what could a guy do without eyesight? And I had ceased to care about looking for the answers when that phone call came. Was that a coincidence? And that's my personal definition for despair. Go back to the days around or surrounding the time when you first came to us, and you'll have your personal definition. But about hope. In the beginning, I found it easy to believe in what you were trying to do. I stayed because you're my kind of people. But deep down inside, where it's quiet and personal, and I didn't let you get, this is what was going on. I believed in what you were trying to do. Then later on, I began to be able to believe in you. And then I came to believe you. And the thing that registered this for me was in 1970 at a convention in Roswell, New Mexico, I heard a magnificent old-timer from Phoenix get up and say, I believe everything that I hear at an Alcoholics Anonymous meeting for one reason. Because when I didn't believe, I got drunk. And it's as simple as that. I said yes, because I was ready to be sober. Perfect. Again, to go back to the gentleman farmer from Laguna. At a place of my progress in the step 2 area, he gave me this. He says, you know, the best way to get to know God is to get mixed up with his kids. And that's where it's at. To summarize this, the 23rd Psalm, permit me a religious reference, talks about thy rod and thy staff, they comfort me. The rod and staff which comforts me in my trip through this experience in life are the members, my fellow members, my family, and the fellowship of Alcoholics Anonymous. And that's just one of the many things I would like to thank you and to thank, of course, Chuck for. In step 2, the principle is hope as it helps us to overcome despair. In step 3, the principle is faith as it helps us to overcome fear. Of course, the term surrender is involved in this step, of course. One of the things I have not heard this weekend, which perhaps bears mentioning, that if you're an alcoholic and you continue to mess with alcohol, alcohol will surrender you. You won't have to worry about surrender. But the principle here is faith as it helps us to overcome fear. And let me talk about this in a little different way. In that 2.5-year business of teaching, I would hang it around this keynote. One night at another step study meeting, I was sitting across, this time an AA step study meeting. I was just there. I wasn't leading or participating or anything like that. A lady sitting across the table from me, about 4 years sober. During the break, she got to talking about the fact that during her first year on our program, she'd lost 70 pounds. But now in her 4th year, she was worried because her weight was creeping up again. And she says, I'm worried about it. I said, well, I have a kind of a thing going with Overeaters Anonymous. I said, why don't you give them a call? I have a great respect for the way they handle the food question. I think they're perhaps among the most intelligent in the country with that. And besides, I went on to explain, they practice our program. They simply lift out the word they lift out the word alcohol in the program and drop in the word food. And it turns out that the problems, the difficulties and whatnot are really the same problems. Chuck calls them Fatties Anonymous, you know. And I said, in fact, they practice our steps just as we do. So this lady, listening to me, she said, but I've already taken the 12 steps. And the way in which she said it prompted me to follow it up. I said, oh, in that case, can you tell me where we find the precise instruction given for the purpose of carrying out the step or the assignment, whatever you want to call it, that is step 3 in our big book? She thought for a minute and she says, oh, I didn't know there was such a thing. And I am using this to make this point with you here. I said to her at that time, oh, my dear lady, if you have done your step 3, but you have not done it in accordance with the suggestions and the discussions and the ideas set forward in chapter 5 for that purpose, I have to ask you, what program are you practicing? It isn't this one. Remember the word precisely. To show other alcoholics precisely how we have recovered. You will find the instruction for step 3 right after the ABCs on page 60 of chapter 5. Let me give you the first 3 sentences. Being convinced we were at step 3, which is that we decided to turn our will and our lives over to God as we understood Him. Just what do we mean by that? And just what do we do? And the next 3 words are, the first requirement is. And if you want to get to those promises, which this lovely lady read for us, we go according to the formula laid out in this book. There is a precise given instruction in the big book in addition to the 12 and 12 for each of these steps. If you want to think of it as a semester assignment or whatever, fine. That's a great way to go. In the interest of time, then, I'll summarize the remainder of the steps and the principles which are associated with them. I have hoped to establish the idea of how, with the help of a good dictionary and a careful reading of our book, you can outline for yourself the program of sobriety, and it will bring a great deal of order to your efforts. In steps 4, 5, and 6, the principle is courage, as it helps us to overcome cowardice. In step 4, we made a searching and fearless moral inventory of ourselves. In step 5, we admitted to God, to ourselves, and to another human being the exact nature of our wrongs. And in step 6, we were entirely ready to have God remove all these defects of character. What? You mean we're not here to get rid of our defects of character? You mean that the people who knew that they had a whole bunch of character defects wouldn't be instantly prepared to dump them, unload them, and whatnot? The answer is no. In fact, all I had going for me in the way of a spiritual life when I got here was made up of my defects of character. But perhaps the best way I've ever heard this explained is that an attorney, he was speaking at a meeting in Texas some years ago. He says, I've discovered something about this defects of character business. I've discovered that if you're no longer enjoying your defects of character, it's because you're not using them properly. And it turns out, amazingly, delightfully, to be so. Notice the wording of the set. We were entirely ready to have God remove them. We're not going to remove them. We're going to get ready to let Him do them. If He sees fit. If He sees fit. Bill even thins out in his discussion of this step in the 12 and 12. We shall have to be, content with patient progress. The whole thing is up to God. But over in chapter 9 is an explanation for how we put our character defects to work. That is how we learn to use them properly. And it's one of the most important things I've ever been given in my life. Cling to the thought that in God's hands your dark past becomes the greatest treasure you possess, because with it you can help another to avoid death and disaster. How's that for an application of my character defects? It is probably more sensible, more to the point, to suggest that we are here to learn to use our character defects properly. In steps 4, 5, and 6, the principle is courage, as it helps us to overcome cowardice. In step 7, we humbly ask Him to remove our shortcomings. Again, those that are going to be removed are up to Him. The principle here is humility, as it helps us to overcome arrogance. Now, I recommend the word arrogance as distinguished from the word pride, because there are positive forms of pride which could bring some confusion to this point if we put it in here instead. But arrogance just about perfectly takes up all the negative aspects of pride. This time, go to a legal dictionary. Arrogance, any determination or intent to substitute one's own attitude or belief for the facts of a matter. Stick to the facts and you will avoid arrogance. Its proper antidote is humility. Listen to a good dictionary. Am I teachable? Am I compassionate? Am I without pretense? Do I have a reasonably accurate and relatively adequate knowledge of my own abilities and limitations? Humility. I don't hear any subservience in there. I don't hear any servile attitude. Humility, as I understand it from these definitions, comes much closer to self-awareness. In steps 8, 9, and 10, the principle is responsibility, as it helps to overcome our tendency toward irresponsibility in what we think, say, do, don't do. In step 8, we made a list of all persons we had harmed and became willing to make amends to them all. In step 9, we made direct amends to all such people wherever possible, except when to do so would injure them or others. And in step 10, we continued to take personal inventory, and when we were wrong, promptly admitted it. These are the responsible acts of the emotionally mature, or those who are developing that maturity. If there's anything common to the expert's description of us, is that we are in need of the development of emotional maturity. I'm being kind this morning. I guess it's Sunday. The principle here in 8, 9, and 10 is responsibility, as it helps us to overcome irresponsibility. In step 11, We sought through prayer and medication. We sought through prayer and meditation to improve our conscious contact with God as we understood Him, praying only for the knowledge of His will for us and the power to carry that out. And the principle here is patience, as it helps us to overcome impatience, to slightly understate the case. We are described by those who know us as people who characteristically overdo or overdid everything. We work too hard, we get too involved, we get too hung up with people, with things, with ideas, with situations, with affairs, obviously with booze. Busy, busy bees, as one person has said, going nowhere in a hell of a hurry, and we don't know what we're going to do when we get there. Patience may be among the most important of these principles we need to begin with when we get here for the first time. I think of the story, short story of the guy who came to our program, and he was an active church member, and he used prayer regularly, and he heard some of our slogans. And if you look around the slogans, you see almost invariably there is an element of patience in the slogan. Easy does it. First things first. Let go and let God. One day at a time. All have the implication of patience. He picked this up, and he decided that patience was so central, so important here, and he was determined to be sober. He thought that he would include a petition for patience in his nightly prayers before he went to bed. But the first time he tried, the story tells us, something slipped, and it came out about like this. And, oh yes, my Heavenly Father, I must find patience now. Now. That's us. This thing is so great, why do we have to wait until tomorrow morning? Well, let's go on through the gears right now. Which allows me to add the further consideration, remember, it may take patience to learn patience. And in step 12, this discussion brings additional meaning to the first phrase of step 12, I believe. Having had a spiritual awakening as a result of these steps, well, how could you miss? Having had a spiritual awakening as a result of these steps, we try to carry this message to alcoholics and to practice these principles in all of our affairs. And the principle here is charity, as it helps us to overcome selfishness and self-centeredness. Chapter 5 thunders at us. Selfishness, self-centeredness, that we believe that we think is the root of our problem. And the charity, the genuine charity, which is represented in our 12-step work, is perhaps the major force that pulls us out of that selfishness and self-centeredness. I like to suggest, just to talk about it, that maybe if AA has a secret weapon, it's the 12th step, or 12-step work. Just a way of making a point. Charity, according to the dictionary, of course, for those who are Christians and into the Christian Bible, my preferred definition for charity is, listen to Paul in 1 Corinthians 13, where he defines it, in my opinion, completely for all time. Faith, hope, and charity, and the greatest of these is charity. 2,000 years ago. But in dealing with those little mundane difficulties that you and I are up against, let me suggest this one, and I base it on a story. Actually, one of our fellow speakers down south made me a gift of the story because of the way he heard me use it. This fellow speaker for many years led a musical group of some kind in one of the lounges or something at Vegas. And he tells of the occasion where he looked out there on the dance floor, and here's a drunk who is so far gone. 3 or 4 sheets in the wind, however you want to say that. And he's out there on the dance floor. He's what they call in Texas almost lap-legged. He's got a glass in his hand, which is about to slosh over. And quite literally, an accident that's simply on its way to happen. So with experience and understanding, our fellow member who was leading the orchestra walked out, and he tells us that he spoke to him. Say, fella, wouldn't you rather, sit down, or you wouldn't want to, whatever. He tells us that the fellow pulled himself up to his greatest height, stared back as steadily as he could, and this was his answer to our fellow member. He said, look here, fellow, there's something I want you to understand. I'm a member of Alcoholics Anonymous. And I'm doing the best I can with what I got to work with. I have to buy it. I have to buy it. It may be the most intelligent statement that guy ever made on any subject, and I hope he made the program. But when I got down to step 4, you took me into my resentments, literally the people that I hated, literally the people that had caused me all this pain and trouble and whatnot. And going from steps 4 through steps 9, you brought me into the understanding that no matter what I thought about them, they had a right to be there. They had a right to be as they were. And if that caused me any difficulty, any pain, any confusion, anything negative, it meant I had to change me. I have no business or license to tamper with the life, attitudes, or beliefs of another human being. Therefore, I recommend, to round off or to tie this thought together, I recommend a definition something like this for the term charity as I understand it. Charity, the quality of mind or attitude which enables me to believe that at any given moment, every human being is doing the best he can with what he has to work with. It helps me to separate the beautifully acceptable for you, the beautifully acceptable you from whatever might have at sometimes been your unacceptable behavior. It is the way to release, as Al-Anon teaches it. It enables me to continue to love you while I help you with your problem behavior. Before, you see, it was your behavior that hung me up, and I couldn't get through to you, and you couldn't get through to me. Charity, in step 12, as it helps us to overcome selfishness and self-centeredness. Let me tie these principles together quite briefly, and I'll sit down. One of our early medical angels, a psychiatrist, Dr. Harry M. Tybalt, in discussing character defects, originally, I think it occurred in the official brochure, Medicine Looks at Alcoholics Anonymous. I understand this has been rehashed, and it's in one of the later brochures now, if it's still there. But this statement is attributable to Dr. Tybalt about the meaning and effect of character defects. The combination, he says, of these character defects in one individual may produce pressure so great that he's forced to find relief. Not because he's an alcoholic, but because he's a human being. I'm grateful for the humanity in that statement. Bill W., our not-so-lately departed co-founder, calls them character faults or flaws. Over on page, I think the bottom of page 74 in the 12 and 12 in his discussion of step 7. Quote, still goaded by sheer necessity, we reluctantly came to terms with serious character faults which made problem drinkers of us in the first place. Problem anything, really. Character flaws which must be dealt with in order to prevent a retreat into or return to alcoholism once again. Call them the exact nature of your wrongs, call them character defects, call them shortcomings, call them flaws, faults, whatever. All of them that I have or that I know anything about could be arranged on an 8-column pad. And at the head of each of those columns would be the negatives of these principles. The negatives. Dishonesty, despair, fear, cowardice, arrogance, irresponsibility, impatience, selfishness, and self-centeredness. I have no trouble, total and complete agreement with both Bill and the doctor. But there's a positive throw to this, too. We know that if our newcomers stay with us, they will come to discover that AA is a way to live, yes. A way of living, yes. A way of life, yes. But my favorite statement on, or to this point, is that Alcoholics Anonymous is an education in the art of living. And the art of living, like any art or trade or profession, carries with it the necessity for the command of certain skills. I'm sure we're all familiar with that. You would not do a good job of baking a cake or riding a bicycle or driving a car or whatever unless you had gained sufficient command of the skills involved. If we look at life in the same way, it's an assignment, it's an undertaking, it's a project, call it what you will. But in order to live a successful, a comfortable, a happy, a positive life, constructive and so on,
we must gain command of certain skills. What are the skills, then, that are necessary to the art or business of living, whichever you prefer? These 8 principles: honesty, hope, faith, courage, humility, responsibility, patience, and charity. It is our great, great good fortune that the guys who wrote our program, who wrote our book, included, that is to say, integrated these spiritual principles in our 12 steps. And it makes my answer to Sybil's question really quite simple. Wes, tell us how you stay sober. I stay sober by the practice of these 12 steps to the best of my ability. One day at a time, every day of my life. And along the way of this process or practice, whereas I came here a physical, mental, emotional, and spiritual mess, I'm not that way today. Physically, I'm enjoying the best health I've ever had. Mentally, an increased order of logical, reasonable, and comfortable thinking. Emotionally, I'm no longer an angry, violent brat traveling around inside the carcass of an adult male. What it means that through this process and here among you, I have begun to grow up. And it's something else, as they say. And spiritually, I have become increasingly aware of, and I'm developing understanding of the presence, the operation of spiritual values in my life. I'm increasingly aware of the presence and power of God in my life. I'm increasingly able to depend on Him. And this whole package has come together to form for me a day-to-day existence for which I like to use the word adventure. As you might get, I have difficulties. I don't call them problems anymore. I have difficulties. But if I do what you tell me to do, if I do what you taught me to do, if I understand why you don't have patience with my childish behavior, I understand that I have you, your support, your love, and I do the best job I can of returning that, I'm going to be all right. Now, as you may have gathered, when I first came to the program, I had eyesight, and during the process, through the years, the eyesight totally disappeared, but I didn't have to drink over it. By that time, perhaps it might be said that I'd gained enough of the development of these spiritual things, this spiritual strength, whatever you want to call it, that I simply call it another challenge in this business of living. And I've always had your understanding, your support. Seems I'm talking about nothing but Chuck today. I was sharing a meeting with him down in Carson, south of Los Angeles, 5, 6, 8 weeks ago. And he said, oh, hell, if I'd have seen you, I'd have made you get up and read chapter 5. That's Chuck. Now, I think I should let you in on something that's really kind of inner circle on this business of sightlessness. If you promise me you'll keep it under your hat. I wouldn't want it to get out too far, you know. All right. This total loss of eyesight is not really the great disaster that understandably you might think it is. It has its points. For example, I've discovered since losing my eyesight that ladies are far more interesting by the Braille method. One, because what other moment in the pitch would I turn to touch her, you know, about that? One last sentence. And I'm sure this great thing will continue for me. And I want you to get it going for you. And I tried to put together some suggestions that will lead in a direction that I think is the most useful. It leads me down to this final thought. I'm sure this great adventure will continue for me so long as God grants me the serenity to accept the things I cannot change, the courage to change the things I can, and the wisdom to know the difference. I think that's really the bottom line. Thanks so much. Good luck and God bless till we get together the next time.